For me, it is a significant privilege to introduce to you Rod Sargent, who is the Navigators Vice President for Development. Rod has been with the Navigators for 38 years, and during most of those years has been involved in fundraising one way or another. And for the last 12 years has been responsible full-time for the development department. Rod is a fully dedicated man who has the touch of God on his life. And that's evidenced by his integrity, which causes people to trust him and the Navigators. Also, it's evidenced by the spiritual ministry that God continues to give him to literally thousands of people monthly. And as you'll see, it's also evident in the insights that God has given him in financing the Lord's work. There just is no other person better qualified to share the history of the Navigator fundraising and lessons learned than Rod Sargent. Now that would be introduction enough, except for a very significant factor. 7 years ago, it was discovered that Rod had cancer. And after major surgery, a year of chemotherapy and prayer, it disappeared and recurred again last year. About 5 months ago, he had major surgery, and they were unable to remove an inoperable tumor. So since that time, he has been on chemotherapy, needs to take pain pills to sleep at night, and each night hooks himself up to a couple bottles that feeds him intravenously all night while he sleeps. Still, he comes to work each day, goes out on fundraising trips, and is here to speak to us this morning. And so I present to you a man of indomitable spirit, a true profile in courage, Rod Sargent.
Thank you. Lauren's introduction reminds me of the story of the gentleman who was being introduced to bring a speech, and the MC went on and on and on and on and on about his world travels and the books he'd read and all of his accomplishments. And at last, it was the speaker's turn to come to the podium, and so he said, "Well, folks," he said, "I just wish that my parents had been here tonight. My father would have been so proud, and my mother, she would have believed it all." Well, the financial folklore of the Navigators describes the highlights of how God has led us over the years relative to fundraising. And I want to share this with you, along with some of the lessons that we learned about fundraising during those early years. Remembering the days of old, as David often did, and as we're going to do for a few minutes this morning, will provide perspective and understanding. It will address the issue of why the Navigators raise money and help answer the question, why don't we just pray and ask God to supply our needs? Both the donors and NAV staff often wonder about this. Some time ago, a donor wrote asking, he said, and I'm quoting, "Where is your faith?" I'll tell you where it is. It's in your fundraising methods. You're looking to methods to supply your needs. That's why you send out financial appeals. All you really need is to trust God. Put your faith in Him instead of your fundraising techniques, and your needs will be met. Well, you know, the fact is that God provided for the financial needs of the Navigators in just exactly that manner for the first 15 years of our ministry. During that time, offerings were never taken, solicitations were never made. As staff, we were instructed never to talk to non-staff people about financial needs. We weren't even to share prayer requests with them about financial needs. That was considered an oblique mention of needs. So a review of our financial folklore will show how God led us as an organization to change our policy from never making needs known to making them known. And a review of our financial folklore will also evoke, I believe, gratitude in our hearts for the good hand of God upon the ministry of the Navigators over the years. When I first joined the Navigator staff, our annual budget was less than $100,000. And I can remember occasions back in those days talking with people in the office about the fact that someday our budget would undoubtedly be as much as $1 million. And yet, this year's budget exceeds $40 million. And God has made all of this possible. He is the source of all that we receive financially. And we praise Him for His marvelous provision year after year in ever-increasing amounts. So I think as we talk about the old days, it will evoke a deep sense of gratitude to God. I'm reminded that back in those early days, when funds were available, and they were not always available, but we who were on staff would receive our weekly salary of $2 a week when funds were available. And then later, a salary increase of almost 300% made us feel rich beyond belief at $7 a week. And this probably doesn't seem like an adequate income. But you know, I can't remember a single need that I had during those early years that God didn't meet. The office staff all lived together. We lived together in Dawson Trotman's home at 519 Monterey Road. I'm sure you've read about that. We took our meals there, and of course, with our housing needs and our food needs met, we didn't have a lot of extra needs. But whenever there was a need, God supplied it. And then, by the late 1940s, the Navigator ministry had been functioning some 15 years. And during this time, our policy had been to make our needs known to God alone. And Dawson had adopted the policy of George Mueller, who simply prayed about needs and then waited for God to supply them. But beginning in the mid-1940s, organizational financial needs began to plague us. Income began to fall off. Bills began to accumulate. And when things reached a sort of a crisis mode, property was sold and the proceeds used to pay off indebtedness. Finally, Dawson decided that the Lord might be leading us to follow Paul's example in support. Paul supported himself through earned income. And we see this in 5 different locations in the New Testament. Acts 18:3 is one. And as a result of this, the Navigators launched 3 projects that were aimed at generating funds that could be used for operational expenses. One of these was a radio store located in downtown Los Angeles. And this business was given the scintillating name Reliable Radio Repair. The second project consisted of an effort to sell fluorescent signs for advertising for small businesses, and this activity was named Superior Sign Service. And with such sensational names, how could either of these businesses fail? Third project was representing a Christian publishing house to all of the Bible bookstores and the religious bookstores west of the Mississippi. And this was how I became a navigator. This was my first function, to function as a traveling salesman or a traveling representative in the western half of the United States. And this job paid a salary plus expenses plus commission. Well, it wasn't long before these 3 ventures were discontinued with the realization that God must have some other plan, some other solution in mind for the Navigators. And it was about then that Dawson decided to share the financial struggles of the last 2 or 3 years with 3 longtime friends of the Navigators. Hopefully, God would give us some direction from their counsel. And the first of these was a businessman who, after listening to Dawson's explanation, said, "Well, Dawson, I've tried to talk with you about finances, but you wouldn't even discuss the subject with me." And I finally concluded there must be some well-to-do individual who was paying all the bills and who wished to remain anonymous. I'm delighted to know my help is needed, and I know others who've been helped by your ministry will feel the same way. The second person Dawson visited was a Mrs. Alexander Kerr, who was the president of the Kerr Glass Corporation in Los Angeles. And during Dawson's explanation of our financial struggles, tears began to trickle down Mrs. Kerr's face. And this was devastating to Dawson. Here he was violating a principle that he had set out to follow and had followed for many years. And so he began to apologize to Mrs. Kerr for whatever he had said that had offended her. And Mrs. Kerr responded by saying, "Dawson, you haven't offended me. These are tears of joy, as I realize now an organization that means as much to me as the Navigators needs my help." And from that time on, Mrs. Kerr graciously and generously and regularly supported the ministry of the Navigators. The third friend, also a businessman, also responded positively. And in addition, he shared a portion of Scripture from 1 Kings 17, primarily verses 2 through 9. And here, as you'll remember, Elijah was required to change from not making his needs known to making his needs known. His initial instructions were to hide in the wilderness by the brook Cherith, and the ravens were to bring him bread and meat each morning and each evening, which they did. But as you know, he had prophesied a 3-year drought, and as a result of the drought, the creek began to dry up. And new instructions arrived from the Lord, telling Elijah to make his needs known to a widow in Zarephath. Well, the counsel of these 3 friends, along with the scriptural precedent in 1 Kings 17, where God changed his method of provision for Elijah, enabled Dawson to seriously consider the possibility that God might be leading the Navigators to change their policy from never making needs known to making them known. And not long after those interviews, a definite decision was made. God was leading the Navigators to change and to begin to make our needs known. I think it's important for you to realize that as staff members, we did not want to do this. We were extremely reluctant. We felt not making needs known was certainly more spiritual, that certainly it was more honoring to the Lord. And looking back on the situation, I also now recognize that I, for one, was proud of the fact that the Navigators didn't make their needs known. And now we had to change and become like everybody else. So with reluctance, and for the first time in Navigator history, a financial appeal was sent to all those on our mailing list. The response was not miraculous, but it was adequate to meet immediate needs. And during the next year and a half, 2 other financial appeals were sent to people on the mailing list. Intellectually, we felt convinced that God had led us to make needs known, but emotionally we were struggling, and consequently, needs were made known, but only after we had reached a crisis position regarding finances. Then in 1951, the Lord led us to launch our very first fundraising campaign. We had to do this because funds were needed to pay off the mortgage on the Los Angeles office building and on the Navigator home where Dawson lived at 509 Monterey Road. The name of this fundraising program was called Anchor Home Base. The financial goal was $51,000, and that to us was significant because it was almost equal to our annual budget. And so now we were faced not only with doing something we had never done before, but we were apprehensive about how our donors would respond to sitting down with many of them face to face, sharing a need and asking for financial help. And we were convinced that there would be much negative response. We just preconceived a negative response from them. Well, when the program had been completed, it was clear that God had blessed the overall effort. There had been almost no negative response, and the goal of $51,000 had been exceeded by 5%. And now, the dust had barely settled on that program when Dawson Trotman arrived home from a trip to Kansas City and announced to us the staggering project of the purchase of Glen Eyrie in 1953. That was 2 years later. And we had visited Glen Eyrie that summer as a staff, and we were excited about the possibility of using this facility. And the way this had come about was that Dawson was looking for property in the Colorado area. We wanted a place that could be used as a training center and as a conference center and as an international and national office. And Dawson had looked at several pieces of property in this area, and also he had visited Glen Eyrie. But Glen Eyrie, in his mind, was larger than what the Navigators needed, and it was certainly beyond our capabilities financially. But Dawson was involved in those days with the Billy Graham Crusades in helping them develop their follow-up program, and after visiting in Colorado Springs, he went to the next Graham Crusade, and he shared with Billy what he had seen here at Glen Eyrie. And he knew that the Graham Association was considering a possibility of beginning a Christian academy. To make a long story short, the Graham Association decided that they would buy Glen Eyrie and that eventually they would develop it into a Christian academy, but in the meantime, the Navigators would use Glen Eyrie until we could find permanent facilities of our own. So we were delighted with this arrangement. The Graham Association paid $50,000 in option money on the property, and they began their fundraising activities. And then 6 weeks before the down payment was due, Billy Graham called this meeting in Kansas City and announced that God had clearly shown him that he was not to diversify his ministries, he was not to begin a Christian academy, but he was also as convinced that the Navigators should have Glen Erie. So he turned to Dawson in the meeting and he said, will you accept the challenge of raising this money and purchasing Glen Erie? And Dawson responded with a very positive yes. By that time, it was obvious to everyone that God had his hand on this property in an unusual way. For instance, the owner, Mr. George Strake, when he learned that the property was to be used for the Lord's work, he reduced the selling price from $500,000 to $300,000. Another evidence of God's working was that Mr. Strake was a prominent Catholic layman, known nationally, knighted by the Pope on the board of directors of Notre Dame University. And for him to have sold this property at any price to a Protestant organization back in the early 50s was remarkable. You have to remember that the climate or the feelings between Catholics and Protestants back in those days was not nearly as cordial as it is today. And this reduced price, along with numerous other evidences of God's hand, influenced Dawson to say yes. The Navigators would assume the responsibility to raise the down payment, $110,000, and accomplish that in 6 weeks. Today, this doesn't seem like very much. But if we were to put it in today's framework in terms of the size of our organization, that $110,000 was more than our annual budget in 1953. So if we were to do a similar thing in 1986, we would be looking at raising in excess of $40 million in 6 weeks. And it took us 3 weeks just to get ourselves organized, just to develop fundraising plans, and to print and produce fundraising materials. And at the end of 3 weeks, we literally had raised no money at all. And I remember how George Wilson, Billy Graham's business manager, called Dawson about that time, and he said, Dawson, how's it coming? He says, you know, if you don't raise that money, we're going to lose our $50,000, and if you're not going to be able to do it, we'd like to know that right now, because we'll get the balance of that money together and not lose our $50,000. And Dawson said, he said, we're going to make it. Well, how much money do you have? Well, he says, I don't know yet, but he says, don't worry. He said, things are going along beautifully. And George said, well, how come you don't know how much you have? And Dawson said, well, we haven't opened the morning mail yet. And somehow he persuaded George that we were, in fact, going to make it. And about that time, we spread out as a staff and began traveling around the U.S., sharing this need. And as we shared it, God laid the project upon the hearts of people in a remarkable way. Everywhere we went, people were interested, and God gripped their hearts, and they gave. And, you know, the largest single gift was only $2,500, and the average gift was $25. And the people who had never heard of the Navigators responded and gave contributions, small contributions, but many, many, many people gave. A businessman in Southern California mortgaged his home in order to give a couple $1,000s. One of the young ladies on our staff gave the money that she had been saving for her trousseau. Some servicemen borrowed money from their chaplain in order to have something to contribute by the deadline. And there were dozens and dozens of stories of sacrificial giving. So this was God at work in the hearts of people. Our staff in Japan told us, don't send us any money that comes in for us during the month of September, but take it all and put it in the Glen Erie project. And since then, they told us that during that month, the amazing thing was that they were supplied so generously that month from local sources in Japan that they had more than normal instead of less. I was raising money in the Southeast and received instructions to meet Dawson Trotman in Houston for the signing of the papers on the day of the deadline. And when I arrived, of course, the first thing I asked Dawson was, how are we doing? Well, it was 2 days before the deadline, and we needed $40,000. That evening, we called the office and learned that that day, $22,000 had come in. That left us with $18,000 that we needed on the day of the deadline, September 29th. One of the businessmen in Houston became excited about what he saw God doing, and he told us the morning of the deadline, he said, I'm going to call a few friends, have them over to the club for lunch, and he said, whatever you need at lunchtime today, I will raise. So just before going to his luncheon, Dawson called the office in Los Angeles, and $10,000 had come in that morning. We went to the luncheon. Mr. Handcammer raised the $8,000 that we needed, went back to his office in the afternoon, called the office again, and discovered that $8,000 had come in at the office. And I remember Dawson's chagrin in going in to see Mr. Handcammer to tell him, we don't need your money. And Mr. Handcammer said, well, it's a big project, and he said, you'll have lots of expenses. I want you to have the money, and you can use it any way you need. Well, the fascinating thing was that when we sat down to execute the papers and to sign the agreements, that an additional $5,000 was needed for fire insurance and an additional $3,000 in legal fees. So God very graciously provided the $118,000 instead of the $110,000. Each year, for 10 years after the down payment was made, we had a property payment of $27,000 due each fall, and each fall God enabled us to raise that money and to make that payment in full and on time, each year for 10 years. Now, we had learned various lessons from this experience, but not all of our financial problems were being resolved. We had effectively raised funds for an exciting project, but we had not yet learned how to effectively raise support for the day-to-day operations here at Glen Eyrie, for the office and the Glen and all. And for several years, we struggled, really struggled, with inadequate operational income. And then finally, in 1963, we faced our problem, and we launched a nationwide program of sharing the Navision and of making our needs known, asking people to support the ministry of the Navigators, and in this instance, we asked each one for a monthly 3-year pledge. In those days, the Navigator ministry was divided up into 13 regions, and we took one region at a time and went into that region and executed our program, our fundraising program. It took us 2 years to go through all 13 regions, but during that time, God enabled us to raise $6 million. It was raised for the needs of the field staff in the region and for operational needs and capital needs here at Glen Eyrie. And so now, for the first time in all those years, the work seemed to be on a very solid footing financially. A few years later, we helped plan and direct a nationwide fundraising program for Great Britain. The interesting aspect of this was that nothing like this had ever been done before in Great Britain, and John Stott advised us not to do it, and he said, if you try, he said, you will undoubtedly fail, because personal solicitation is an American fundraising method that would be repulsive to the British. But after months of prayer and thought, the American and the British staff in Great Britain felt God's leading. And we went ahead with the program. We trained staff in 5 key ministry cities throughout Great Britain, and we began to share the ministry and the vision of the Navigators, asking people personally for pledges and financial support. The response was positive. It was enthusiastic. There were almost no negative responses. Some people came to know the Lord through this program, which has always been true in our major fundraising campaigns, and the financial objective was reached. Also in 1973, the U.S. Navigators launched their fourth major fundraising effort, and this was known as Decade of Development, and funds were raised for operational expenses and also for capital needs. Some of you were around, and I see the recognition in your eyes of those days, and you were involved with us in helping raise that money. The goal was about $4 million, and this goal was also achieved, and the money was used to build Bighorn. We had to spend $250,000 bringing city water into Colorado Springs. They would not allow us to build any new buildings until that had been done. We made some improvements in the castle. We built a 10,000 square foot maintenance building down here, and we also built the U.S. headquarters office building that you're familiar with. But once again, we had launched a major effort, and God had blessed. So here's a summary of the major fundraising events over a 30-year period. 1949, God led the Navigators to change from never making needs known to making them known. 1951, Anchor Home Base was launched. 53, the purchase of Glen Eyrie. $118,000 raised in 6 weeks. From 54 to 64, annual property payments made on time and in full. 63 and 4, the National Development Program, over $6 million raised. 73, Program for Progress in Great Britain, also 73, Decade of Development. So that's a resume. That's our financial folklore. And I think you can see that God's hand has been very evident in these things, and that he has very graciously blessed and prospered the work of our hands. Let me mention a few of the lessons that we have learned from these experiences. For instance, we learned that making needs known was a biblical method of financial support that had both Old Testament and New Testament validation. The first one, not the first, but one of the early evidences in the Old Testament was where God told Moses to build the tabernacle, and he said, secure the resources from the people. So he made the need known to the people, Exodus 35, and they gave so generously that he finally had to tell them he had enough not to bring any more. I've always thought that's what I'm living for. I'd be ready to be raptured if that ever happens in the Navigators. We recognized also that self-support was a valid principle for the support of a Christian ministry, whether it's an organization or an individual. And we see this Acts 18:3 and other places, Paul's example. We also recognize that another method of support for a Christian ministry is to ask no one but God. There's no verse, no particular verse that states this as a principle. But I think Philippians 4:19 might come as close as any. And then, of course, we learned some other lessons that didn't have to do with how we should be supported. But, for instance, I believe we learned that, generally speaking, God supplies the financial needs of NAV staff and the organization in direct proportion to the time and the energy and the prayer and the skill that is invested in making needs known. I think we learned that there are no quick, easy solutions for funding a ministry, that careful planning along with plenty of prayer and hard work are necessary. We cannot be successful in our fundraising without those ingredients. We learned that God can be honored and glorified through the method of making needs known. We learned that doing a thorough job in the ministry does not always ensure adequate funds, that making needs known and asking for financial support are often necessary. We learned that Navigator constituents enjoy sharing in the support of the Navigator ministry, and they like the encounter. When it's done properly, they enjoy the encounter of being asked. And it makes them feel like they are a part of the Navigator ministry. And we have a tendency often to sort of hold people at arm's distance. And people feel like we're kind of exclusive. Well, when we can ask them and make them a part of our team through their prayer and financial support, they like that. We learned that a donor must be cultivated, he must be informed, he must be developed as a genuine friend of the organization, that it's much more important to get the individual than to get his money. We learned that fundraising efforts must always result in broadening the base of support. And we should always be on the lookout for new prospects and asking the Lord to put us in touch with people who would love to support this kind of a ministry if they only knew more about it. And we've seen this to be true over and over and over and over again. Wish we had time to tell you some of the stories. And we learned that the secret of fundraising, the three secrets of fundraising are see people personally, and see people personally. Of the billions of dollars that are contributed each year in America, approximately 84% of the, I think maybe the last year it was recorded, that would be 80, probably 84, about $64 billion was contributed toward charitable causes in America. And 84% came from individuals.
We discussed earlier 7 important attitudes to have in raising our support, and now we'd like to talk about some mistakes to avoid. So here's some common mistakes that we often make, but we're going to avoid from now on. Number 1 is relying on mail appeals for monthly support. Here's a typical example. One of our East Coast staff sent out a letter to 300 people on his mailing list. He was a well-known veteran staff, had a very dynamic ministry, and he told me out of the 300 letters I sent out, only 3 came back, and one of those was from my father-in-law. Well, he didn't do too well. Now, somebody may object and say, wait a minute, we got a tremendous response on our mailing piece. The chances are it was for cash and not monthly. When you hear of tremendous responses to mail appeals, it's usually for cash. Mail appeals will work well for a cash project one time, but if you ask for monthly in the mail, it usually won't come out so well. Look at this diagram from the Harvard Business Review. It's obvious that one-to-one conversations are the most effective way of communicating. Mail communications are in 5th, 6th, or 7th place. For raising monthly support, personal appeals, in person, one-to-one, are by far the best. Also, a mail appeal quickly uses up all your prospective givers. After you sent them out a mail piece, and they say no to it, or that you don't hear back from them, you assume they said no, do you then feel comfortable to go back a second time with a personal interview or a phone call? A lot of us wouldn't. Mass mailing is a quick way of getting disappointing results. Now, wait a minute. That takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. Yes, but fundraising is a part of your job, not a distraction from it. The money you raise eyeball to eyeball, sitting in a person's home, with their kids spilling Kool-Aid on you, that money will last longer, the bonding is greater, and you'll enjoy it more. Now, sometimes the staff say, well, we've done all we can to raise our support, and it didn't come in. Maybe the Lord isn't leading us into full-time service after all. Well, let me suggest this. Maybe you've done all you can using poor methods. Now try using good methods and see what happens. Don't be too quick to conclude that the Lord is not calling you. A second mistake is the failure to cultivate. You should never run out of prospective givers. Think 1, 2, 3 years ahead of time. Build friendships, create interest, add everybody to your mailing list that you can. As they get acquainted with your vision, they'll gladly welcome a fundraising call from you. We added a couple to our mailing list about 3 years ago. They were strangers to us. We sent them a personal letter or two, made a phone call or two, went to see them once. And then last summer, while we were raising support to come here, I tried to set up an appointment. We stopped in to see them, but they were on vacation, and later on I called. On the phone, I made the appeal. They were very eager to give, and by return mail, sent a check for $240 with a pledge card for $20 a month. Just like that. Now, what's the point? Well, the point is this. I could never have done that if I had not cultivated that relationship. That's the key. Now, this brings up the question of mailing lists. Well-written newsletters are an excellent means of communicating your vision. Many staff are cutting their mailing lists down, trying to save money, trying to save energy. I say expand them. If you only mail to your donors and a few select prayers, it's robbing you of a great opportunity to have more people get acquainted with your dazzling vision. And so really you're hurting yourself. As you keep telling your story to a broader and broader audience, more and more people are becoming acquainted with what you're doing. And they're more likely going to be willing to say yes to a financial appointment. And even if they never give, you've had a ministry to them. There's a second reason for having a large mailing list, and that is you never know whom God has appointed to share in your support. I've heard dozens of staff say, wow, we never dreamt that so-and-so was going to give to us. And oftentimes the people you're just sure are going to give are the ones that don't, and the ones that you wouldn't ever think would do. Isn't that the way it works? So by having a large mailing list, you can stumble across such people. Hebrews 13:2 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by it some have entertained angels unaware. Show hospitality to strangers through your newsletters. You're going to run across some angels who are going to be delighted to participate in your support. Now Luke 8:1-3 lists the names of those who supported Jesus: Mary, Joanna, Susanna. And it also says many others who were contributing to their support out of their private means. Underscore that, many others. Now, Luke didn't write this verse as a proof text for having a large mailing list, obviously. But I think it's interesting to notice that Jesus didn't have just a few people supporting him and the 12, but there were many. Okay, where can you start? At least start by getting them on your mailing list. Start to acquaint them with the vision God has given you. All right, how do you add people to your mailing list? Well, here's a couple ideas. Number one, have a sign-up list at conferences or seminars. Just have a sheet of paper sitting in the back. Number two, do something outside the NAVs 2 or 3 times a year. I think one of our best givers comes from a church where I substituted for a pastor one Sunday in 1971. And they're still sticking with us today. What about just casual acquaintances? Just put down everyone you can think of. What about after Sunday evening church? Have a couple over for dessert. Here's how I do it. I say to a person, we have a newsletter we send out 4 times a year. It's really great stuff. It tells about our vision, it tells about our family, and it tells about the disciple-making work we're in. I'd really like to send it to you. It comes in a brown paper bag, no salesman will call. And they say, sure, send it. I've never had anybody say they didn't want to receive it when it's approached that way. But the key phrase is, put them down. Don't ask yourself the question, does this person want to give? Because then you'll conclude, well, probably not, and you won't add them. Ask yourself the question, would this person like to receive news of my vision and news about me or my family 4 times a year? That's the question. And the answer to that is most likely going to be yes. See, whether they give or not, you still had a ministry to them. Now, this means if you're going to add people like this, that you may have to change your newsletter somewhat. It means you can't be hinting around for money all the time. Now, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, right? But the second best time is today. So let's get started on adding to the list. Question, how do you purge a mailing list? How do you condense it down to a smaller size? The answer, why on earth would you want to? The usual way of purging a mailing list, and of course it's silly to do it, is to send out these cards. You've done it perhaps, I know I've done it, and ask them, would you like to stay on my mailing list, send the card back, and so on. Well, we did that in our first assignment in Iowa City. My donors didn't even send the card back. Nobody sent the card back. I'm not going to do that again. Listen to this example. Here's a guy who sent out a card. He said, we got quite a few cards back from people saying they want to continue getting our newsletter. If you do not send a reply, but still receive this letter, it's because we want to give you a second chance. So he didn't take them off anyway. Interesting. If you're going to remove people, remove them one by one. Call them up on the phone and ask them, you get my letter? Yeah, would you like to continue getting it? No, and then it's done. Chances are they're going to say, yes, I'd like to continue getting it. Then you can say, would it also be convenient for me to come by sometime and explain our ministry to you in more detail? So you see, instead of getting them off, you're bringing them closer. But that takes time. Now the question arises, how do I minister to a large mailing list? I'm overstretched and overworked right now. How am I going to do it with even more? That's a good question, and I'm not suggesting that you add extra work onto what you're already doing. But I am suggesting that something else in your activities will have to go. I'm suggesting not extra work, but rearranged priorities. Here's a few ideas on how to minister to those extra people on your mailing list. A, plan to give about 10% of your work time to your constituency, either donor ministry or actual fundraising. You can't do donor ministry or fundraising on the backstroke. You have to plan it in. And I'd suggest 10% of your time. B, realize that constituency development is not as intense as a ministry in your target. Don't try to minister to the 400 people on your mailing list with the same intensity with which you minister to your key man. That would be difficult. Redefine your definition of ministry. A well-written newsletter is a ministry. C, segment your mailing list. You can't do the same thing with everyone. You're selective in your target ministry, be selective in your constituency ministry. And finally, beware of over-conscientiousness. Some staff are in turmoil if they don't write a note on every newsletter. Of course they're trying to cut their list down. They've got to save their jangled nerves. Let's talk for a minute about this phenomenon of notes on newsletters. One staff woman told me that she had in December a stack of newsletters all set to go out. Ready to write notes on them, ready to send them. But she said, you know, I only mailed out about half of them because I ran out of time, and now it's May, and I still have part of the stack sitting there. She couldn't find the time to write notes on them, so her friends got no news because she felt she had to write on every one. Are notes on newsletters a good thing? Yes, they certainly are, but let's not get paranoid about it. Let's not overdo it. Actually, a written note on the bottom of a newsletter can take away from the effect of the printed page. It can tend to make it seem less important. Some staff even apologize that they can't write every person individually. Don't do that. If you take the time to write a good letter, don't apologize for it. If that newsletter is well thought through, prayed over, that'll be a ministry. The printed piece of news that you send them is more than they send you, isn't it? I mean, do your donors write you? Not very much. So you're sending them 3 or 4 or 5 times as much as they write you, and you feel guilty if you don't add a little extra note on it. Well, now, wait a minute. What did they send to you? It's not much. Also, some of the notes that we write on the bottom of these newsletters are not much, are they? So you've got 93 to go, so you can't take a lot of time and write a sincere note on every one. How's the kids? Write sometime, and it's done. Everything okay with you? Great, write sometime, and it's done. Some of you have put the same note on the same letter for 3 or 4 times running. You'll be surprised to discover if your donors could find they'd show you those newsletters with the same note every time. I worry about that I've written this person, send me a letter sometime. How's the kids? How's it going? Keep in touch. Off it goes. Let me suggest this. Instead of writing that superficial note on 93, pick out 25. Take your time. Write a couple of paragraphs on that. Then the next newsletter, pick out a different 25 and write a sincere note on that. Let's not be in bondage to writing a note on every newsletter. Here's a third mistake, and it's the failure to ask. Or we might call this assuming money always follows ministry. A veteran NAV staff told me, my first assignment, we didn't have to raise support. We just did the work and the money came in. The problem is now in his second assignment, it's not working that way, and he's wondering what's wrong. We tend to idealize those situations where the money is supplied without asking. We think that's of the Lord. But is it any less of the Lord when we make appeals in faith and people respond? The first $100 in your support will probably come in more or less automatically. But if you're going to get up to budget, there will have to be some appeals made. Now, there's staff around the country who have ministered directly to dozens or even hundreds of people. And some of these staff are silently waiting for those dozens they've led to Christ, those dozens they've counseled and trained, those dozens who have lived in their apartment or their home. They're waiting for them to get with it and to start giving or to restart their giving again. And they're feeling hurt and frustrated. But it's not going to happen. Those people are not going to start giving again unless they're asked. These staff are living on the assumption that if you are successful in the Lord's work, you will be provided for. And it's just not true. Money doesn't always follow ministry. A NAV staff visited in the home of some of our friends from Minneapolis. They were in our Sunday school class, and the staff member had ministered to this couple in the past. They were good friends. And he presented them with a dynamite display of his overseas ministry. Then he came back and told them about his new ministry as well. They stayed overnight, had great fellowship. And here's a conversation I had with our friends a few weeks later. I said, did the staff member invite you to give toward his support? I said, no. Is he still on the staff? Oh, yes. He told us about his new assignment. Well, does he still have a need? Well, yeah, we think so. He's on the staff, isn't he? Yes, okay. So we support him overseas, but you're not supporting him now. Do you suppose that he has a financial need? Well, I wonder if he does. I wonder if that's why he came to visit us. So you knew that he had a financial need, but you're not giving to him. Oh, no. I said, may I ask why you're not giving to him? And then the guy and his wife looked at each other and kind of sheepishly grinned and said, well, he didn't ask. And that is true. There are people who are waiting to give to you if you would only invite them. Not just make your need known, but invite them. There's a difference between making your need known and inviting them to give. Osmosis doesn't work. Don't assume that people know of your financial situation. And if they know it, don't assume they're going to start giving. On the outside, we're asking for prayer. But on the inside, we're praying, God, make them give. Please make them give. But we would never say that. We want prayer or something else. People don't naturally gravitate toward making stewardship decisions. They tend to postpone it. They tend to procrastinate it. If you want someone to make a decision about finances, you have to ask them to make a decision. A 13-year-old girl named Marquita Andrews in New York City found that out. In 1984, she sold 25,000 boxes of Girl Scout cookies. Walt Disney featured her in a sales production called The Cookie Kid, and IBM flies her around the country to address its sales force. Here's what she says. She's in 8th grade. She says, this is the key. You can't just chat. You have to ask for an order. Well, I'm not suggesting that raising support is like selling Girl Scout cookies, but there's a principle there. We have to ask for a decision instead of just chatting. Now, an issue related to osmosis is hinting. A businessman told Lawrence Sanney, says, you Christian workers are too mealy-mouthed when it comes to money. A friend of mine in Minneapolis, who supports several NAV staff and has been approached by several others, told me this. He said, Scott, tell the staff to come right out and ask. Don't let them beat around the bush. Most people appreciate a straightforward, honest appeal. A fourth mistake is multiple appeals. A returned IT had been in the States for about a year and then was proceeding to his new assignment, so started his fundraising. He made 113 phone calls from people who had been on his mailing list while he was in IT. They were friends. They were fairly loyal people. Of the 113 phone calls, he got 63 face-to-face appointments. But of the face-to-face appointments, only 12 of those loyal friends contributed toward his monthly support. Something was going wrong, and he couldn't figure out what it was. I finally asked him, I said, what is it that you say when you actually end the interview? He says, well, I ask him to do 3 things. I say, would you consider giving toward our monthly support, or a cash gift, or would you just like to pray for our work? He said most of them decided to pray. We gave them 3 choices. Too many choices. You'll do better if you ask for one thing. Don't ask for cash and monthly at the same time. I'd suggest you ask for monthly first. Get that up, and then go for cash. You know, in evangelism, we only ask for one thing, don't we? I mean, have you ever asked somebody, will you receive Jesus Christ? And will you join my church? And will you stop smoking? Take your pick. One thing. Let's do that in fundraising as well. Now, let's talk about some guidelines. Those are the mistakes we want to avoid. What are some specifics on guidelines? Number one, develop a plan. And your plan should be from the Lord and tailored specifically to you. We spend days alone with God, and we work hard to discover what He wants us to do in our target ministry. But we often backstroke our fundraising or our donor ministry. I was trying to help a staff develop his financial plan a year or so ago, and we weren't getting anywhere. And I finally said, you know, you haven't put much time in on this, have you? He confessed, said, no, I haven't. I said, I think you better go put some time, you better get with the Lord. Well, he came back a couple days later, excited about a plan because he'd been with the Lord. He'd thought it through, he'd prayed over it, and that makes all the difference. Don't just dive into fundraising flippantly. Think it through. Should you make appeals? If so, to whom? What are you going to say? When are you going to do it? Think it through. And furthermore, just as David did not fit into Saul's armor, so you should not copy someone else, either on their fundraising or in their newsletters. Get a word from the Lord, and then you'll be confident. Well, how do you get a plan? Well, I suggest two things. Number one is prayer or meditation, just time with God. Pray over your promises. Pray over some of these great passages on giving or on fundraising. Pray through your mailing list, name by name. And secondly, you need to know the state of your flock. Study your donor records. Analyze your mailing list. That will give you ideas. Write down all your ideas. Now, don't feel obligated to carry out every one of your ideas. As Elma tells me, Scott, some of your ideas are good. And those I hope to carry out. The night before Thanksgiving in 1982, I was a bit discouraged. We were $300 below budget, and we were going to have Thanksgiving dinner the next day, and so I sat down at a ping pong table in our basement, and the next day there'd be a crowd of people around there eating, and I was discouraged. As I prayed and studied through our donor records, I found that we had only 6 people that were giving us $30 a month. And I got the idea to invite 10 people to give $30 a month. That would be $300. And I thought I could do it with phone calls. That idea gave me courage. It clicked, and I launched out on that. It also helps me to pray through my mailing list. We have the people on our mailing list on a Rolodex, and I like to turn through the names, starting with the A's, one by one, and say, Lord, is this one? Lord, is this one I should talk to? And those that I have a rather subjective impression on, I pull out and set aside, and I'll keep going all the way through the Z's. Then I take those 10 or 20 that I've discovered, and I'll pray through them a second time, asking the Lord to lay in my heart those that I should talk to. If you don't have a strategy, your fundraising will be from crisis to crisis, and you'll get sick of it quickly, and you begin to wonder if maybe the Lord is even leading you in this work. Proverbs 19:21 says, many are the plans in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord, it will stand. Number 2, individualize your appeals. Here's a letter sent to Rod Sargent in 1983. Can you identify the fundraising error? My husband and I became engaged in January, at which time I wrote a letter to all my friends telling them our joyous news. It strikes me rather odd that all my non-Christian friends, as well as our non-Navigator friends, wrote expressing congratulations. But only one couple on the Navigator staff did out of quite a few. One couple sent a duplicated letter without even a personal word attached, saying they would be in the area and would like me to sponsor a dinner or something at my church for them for fundraising. I was very hurt. They had not even congratulated us on our engagement, nor made mention of our forthcoming marriage. Now, what's the problem here? A fundraising gathering is not a bad idea. The problem is that the plan was not individualized. The staff didn't take the time or energy to treat this person as an individual, and it presumed upon a relationship that was not there. It would have been better, and this whole thing could have been avoided if there had been a long-distance phone call made, talked to the person, and on the phone they could have figured out how they felt about it. We don't have time for that. We're too busy for that. Send the letter out. Slam, bang, get it done. Get it done quick. Remember, one-to-one conversations are the most effective. Secondly is a phone call with a follow-up letter, or a letter with a follow-up phone call, either one. Thirdly is a personal letter, and fourthly is an appeal letter. Take a look at the best candidates sheets that you have in your notes. These best candidate sheets give you a space to write down 40 prospective givers in sets of 10. These are people that you plan to visit individually. You don't know if they'll give, but you sense they'd be willing to hear you explain your vision. Whether they give or not is between them and the Lord. So you list their name, then you put down their location. And you may find several in the same city or the same state. That will help you with your travel plans. Next, you put down a giving goal. What would you like to see them give? Now, you don't know their financial situation in detail, so you're not telling them what to give. That's between them and the Lord. But this is what you'd like to see them give. Go back to your plan. Are you looking for $10 $50 givers? Are you looking for $25 $40 givers? That will help you to decide how much you're going to invite them to give. It doesn't depend on what you know of their finances. By the way, the average household in America has an income of $28,000 per year. That's $2,300 per month. 10% of that would be $230 per month. We need to realize that a $50 to $100 monthly gift is not exorbitant on that kind of income. The average monthly gift to a NAV staff couple is about $40 to $50. For single women, it's lower. But the most popular gift size that the Navigators receive by far is $25. What's second? Second is $50, by far. $50 gifts far outrank even $30 or $40 gifts. Now, I say this to encourage you to think a little bigger. At one of our earlier seminars, we had to help a guy learn to say 50. Just couldn't get it. Couldn't get it out of his mouth, 50. And we may have to have some help with this group on that as well. We need to practice saying 50, and then we'll want 100. Next, put a date down under the calendar. When would you like to see these people? The advantage of one-to-one visits is it enables you to individualize your appeal. And that opens up even more opportunities to minister. But ask yourself the question, for everyone that you plan to talk to, how would this person like to be approached? No shortcuts. Do that for every person. On the last page of these best candidate sheets, you'll find a place for the names of people that you'll not be able to visit in person. This would be for a phone call or a letter. Number 3, communicate urgency. An appeal must have a sense of immediacy. In Exodus 35, when Moses told the people to take a contribution to the Lord to build the tabernacle, there was an urgency about it. People sprang into action. They were going to build that thing immediately. They even had to restrain the people from bringing gifts. We've got enough. Stop. Now, suppose Moses would have said this. I'd like to have a tabernacle here. Not going to use it for a while, maybe in 10 years or so, and I'd like to have some of you pray about how we might do this. Or perhaps some of you know some people that might be willing to contribute to it. There's no urgency there. There's no excitement about that, no immediacy. Which of the following 2 statements has more urgency? Number 1, please pray for our finances. Number 2, our ministry thrust begins August 15th. We must be fully subscribed by then. Well, that's got a lot more urgency to it, doesn't it? How do you develop urgency? 2 questions. Why do I need the money? Secondly, why do I need the money now? Why do I need the money? Why do I need it now? If you don't have a good answer to those 2 questions, then you're not ready to do fundraising. The practical application is give people a deadline. Now, how much time should you allow for a deadline? Well, it will vary, but I'd suggest that the starting date of your ministry, or when you leave, obviously to go overseas, that would be the obvious deadline. But after you talk to people, how long should you give them? I'd say 10 days to 2 weeks. If you haven't heard from them, simply call them back. Number 4, use a response vehicle, that is, a pledge card. About 8 years ago, a young staff friend of mine told me that he'd visited 30 people, and 29 of them had agreed to give. He was excited. But he hadn't used a pledge card. I said, why not? He said, these people all know the Navigators, they're friends of mine, they know the Nav system, no need to use a pledge card. Great. August 1 went by, no money. September 1 went by, no money. Finally, he sent a card out to all 30, and the next month, all the money came in. People need a reminder. They need something to help them remember that it's time to give. Even well-meaning friends need a reminder. Paul used a response device of sorts in 2 Corinthians 9:5. He says, I thought it necessary to urge the brethren to go on ahead and arrange your previously promised bountiful gift. Paul himself is coming to get the gift. In 1 Corinthians 16:2, he encouraged the church to set aside their giving on the first day so there be no gatherings when I come. Paul was coming to pick up the money. That's a pledge card. The local church has a response device. It's called an offering plate, or they might call it Stewardship Sunday, but they have a device. Once I gave a presentation for Neil Grindheim, who was on his way to Indonesia. He had about 20 couples into his home, and I gave what was probably the talk of the century on why these folks should give towards Neil and Sue's support. It was a great talk, and as we were going out the door that evening, Neil thrust a pledge card in my face. He says, "Scott, I'd like to have you and Elma pray about joining our financial support team." And I thought, good joke, Neil. I'm the speaker, I'm not the giver, but good joke. He wouldn't let me get away. He said, "No, Scott, we're serious." And he looked me in the eye again and said, "Would you consider joining our support team?" Well, I took the pledge card and grumbled on the way home and put the card on my desk and prayed about it for a while, and in 10 days, I sent it back to Neil saying we'd be delighted to pledge $25 a month toward his vision. I couldn't get him out of my mind. The pledge card was a silent reminder of Neil and Sue. Don't overlook the value. Now, have the pledge card returned directly to you. Don't have it sent back to headquarters. Why would I say that? Well, it takes too long for you to find out the donor's decision. Suppose the donor mails the card back August 28. Headquarters gets it September 2 or 3. But when do you find out about it? October 10. That's too late. In the meantime, you're wondering, has the donor made a decision? And the donor's wondering why they haven't heard from you. They're wondering if you got the money. So have it sent back directly to you, and then you can forward it on to headquarters. Now, by the way, when you send the pledge card in after you get it back from your donor, it's really helpful to put your EMF number right on the card. That helps receipting. What if they don't send the card back to you? Well, remember when you give the presentation to give them a deadline. But if you still haven't heard in a couple of weeks, then simply call them up and ask the question, have you come to a decision regarding our financial support team? All right, number 5, fundraising is a process, not an event. Fundraising should show up in your job description, your yearly objectives, and your schedule. Does fundraising show up in your job description? Does it show up in your yearly objectives? And does it show up in your schedule? It should. You can't do all your fundraising at one time and then coast for years any more than you can eat a large meal at one time and then coast for years. It simply won't work. You've got to keep at it. When I was a kid back in Iowa, we used to take vacations into southern Minnesota, and this was really exciting, to fish for bullheads on Lake Benton. I mean, we thought that was great. And I was a line jerker and a bait checker. And so my uncle always had to tell me, "Scott, keep your line in the water and you'll catch more fish." And the same is true in fundraising. I try to keep my line in the water all the time. I always want to have somebody praying about one of my pledge cards. When I get that one back, that's my signal to talk to someone else. If the only time you work on fundraising is in a crisis, you'll tire of it very quickly. So how much time is enough? How do you put it on a schedule? Let me suggest 10% of your work week for either fundraising or donor ministry. Now, by the way, your supervisor will approve your taking time for fundraising. If necessary, work it out with him. If something else in the ministry has to drop, so be it. Don't add fundraising onto the top of an already too busy schedule. Now, supervisors, let me speak with you for just a minute. Be careful of the Egyptian taskmaster syndrome. More bricks, no straw. Here's what we say. Supervisors say something like this: get up to budget, but don't drop evangelism. Meet one-to-one with your laborers team, and keep that couple's Bible study going. Oh, and by the way, you really ought to be doing something with your church. And I wonder if you could direct the conference next month. And be sure to take all the time you need for fundraising. That's how it works. Let's be realistic. Supervisors, you're giving a mixed signal. Sit down with your staff and help them work out a calendar so that they don't get crushed. Don't let fundraising be the straw that breaks their back. Number 6, appeal in specifics. One of the ITs we sent out a few years ago came to me all excited and said, "Scott, out of my top 25 prospective givers, 24 of them gave." And she was really excited. I said, "Well, how much are they giving?" She said, "About $500 a month." "What's your budget?" Well, the budget was $950. Now she had to raise an additional $450 from people that she didn't know very well. I said, "Did you ask them to give a certain amount?" She says, "No, I'm just glad they're giving." Well, ask people to give in certain amounts. Never just ask them to give. Ask them in a range. This is called proportionate giving. Some people have the ability and interest to give more than others. And remember that people often give exactly what you suggest. If you ask for $40, you'll likely get $40. Prospective givers need to know your plan. They may be overwhelmed by your total need, but they really want to know what they could do that would make a meaningful difference in your getting up to budget. So give them an amount. That means you'll have to have spent some time thinking and praying that through. Now, there might be some exceptions to this rule, and that would be very wealthy people. They don't like to feel boxed in because they could give the whole thing anyway. Now, how much do you ask for? Well, don't just pick a number out of the air. It depends somewhat on the financial situation of the person you're asking, but it also depends on the plan the Lord has given you. Last summer, we had only time to visit about 20 people, and we had about $1,000 to raise. So we invited these 20 to give 50, and many of them gave in that amount. Now, what if they can't give as much as you're suggesting? Will they feel pushed or manipulated? I don't think so. I always close with 2 Corinthians 9:7 about being a cheerful giver. And we talk about that verse a bit. And I tell them I'm not there to twist their arms, but I encourage them to do what they think is best, because that's what I want to. I was calling on an Iowa farmer. We sat at his kitchen table. Blue silos loomed out the windows. We got to the last page, and this was several years ago. And there was a diagram on the last page that showed some $10 givers and some $25 givers. And I looked him right in the eye. And I said, if 10 people gave $10 per month, and if 10 people gave $25 per month, this need would be met. He looked me right in the eye and said this. He says, I suppose all the $10 ones are taken. D.L. Moody knew the secret of specific requests. He was once asked to help raise money for a mission in Edinburgh. And he said he would help if the church would furnish him with a preacher to go along and introduce the subject. And this is from his biography. This request was granted, and a fine, delicate, courteous preacher of immense personal influence and immeasurably long legs was pressed into service. They started out together, and this reverend gentleman preferred modest sums, ranging from 10 to 15 pounds. I saw, said Mr. Moody, it was going to take all winter at this rate, and so, not daring to criticize him, when we came to the home of a very grand and wealthy woman, I said, how much are you going to ask her for? Oh, perhaps 50 pounds. I kept still. But when the door opened into the room where she was, I just pushed ahead, and I said, Madam, I have come to ask you for 2,000 pounds for a mission at Carruber's Close. She threw up both hands and exclaimed, oh, Mr. Moody, I cannot possibly give more than 1,000. This reply astonished the timid minister so much that he almost fainted. And when they got outside, he said, you'd better go on ahead, Mr. Moody. The next day I left town. And not long afterwards, I received a note saying, well, Moody, you raised the money, but you used up the best minister in Scotland, and we had to send him off for 3 months vacation. Interesting story. Number 7, seek to receive a large share of your income from a few givers. A NAB missionary told me he had a new definition of furlough. He asked if I wanted to hear it. Well, since he was going to tell me anyway, I said, sure, I'd love to hear it. He said, furlough. 12 months of exhaustion, chasing around the country, thanking $5 givers, furlough. You know, he had a point. He was grateful for givers. He genuinely was. But he said he dreaded furlough because it meant chasing around the country, trying to find smaller givers. He wanted a few larger givers. If a missionary has a budget of $3,000 and had only $20 givers, he would need at least 150 of them every month. If he had a $4,000 budget and had only $20 givers, he'd need 200 of them every month. Now, if you're going to reach a budget of even $1,500 a month, you're going to need several large pledges. If you're going to reach a budget of $3,000 to $4,000, you're going to need 8 to 10 $100 givers and 20 to 30 $50 givers. It's just necessary, or you won't even make it. Secular fundraisers say that 1/3 of your money should come from your 10 largest givers. Now, that's for a cash project, and that's what secular people have found. But for a $3,000 or more budget, I'd recommend that you try to get half your money from your $50 and above givers. Otherwise, you'll come up with another definition of furlough. Tell your $50 and above candidates that the Navigators have advised you to secure quite a number of $50 to $150 givers. And you can quote that. It's essential for the good of our work. Now, here's an idea for veteran staff. New staff, you don't really need to apply this, but you will in about 5 years. In 1977, I noticed that a lot of our regular givers were dropping off. We were replacing them with new ones, and we liked adding new givers, but we were disconcerted by the fact that we seemed to be losing our old friends. The average life of a NAV donor is about 7 years. Now, it's a little longer for a staff-only donor, but I noticed that we were losing these people who'd given 5, 6, 8, or 10 years. I didn't like that too well. Then I noticed another frustration. I wanted to mention personal prayer requests, intimate news to the 500 people on our mailing list, but I couldn't really tell them everything. I couldn't tell them all I wanted to tell them. And then I wondered who really prayed for us, who really cared about us, who was watching out for our souls. I longed to be able to share intimate prayer requests with somebody. And then I noticed that I wasn't really very effective at ministering to the 100 regular donors that we had, let alone the 50 or more who gave occasionally over a 2 or 3 year period. The result of all this frustration was what I call the support club. A support club is made up of people who have said yes to the following questions. Will you give $50 per month and increase it as the years go by? Will you pray earnestly for our ministry, for our family, and our personal lives? And will you hold us accountable in our walk with the Lord? Will you keep an eye on us? I invited people to join the support club one by one, never through the mail. I told them I didn't want to turn over our friends every 7 years, but we needed people who would give to the Mortons for either their life or our life. So a support club is not made up of your biggest givers, but rather your best friends. You don't need to know them well, but you need to have a sense of mutual caring. What is our promise to the support club? We promise to send them personal news and prayer requests that other people on our mailing list would not get. And I send these out whenever I sense a need for prayer. There's nothing regular about it. I also told them I would not be signing these letters. They're memos. I asked the support club in the beginning when I signed them up, say, would you like me to sign the letters and write notes on the bottom? Or would you like just to get the hot news? They said, send us the hot prayer news while it's still timely. You don't need to sign them. So we made that agreement. That removes a mental block in my mind. Those letters could be unsigned, no notes written. They can go out the day I think of sending them. I average about 1 memo per month. Secondly, we promised to hold them accountable too. We had the liberty to question them on any subject just as they do us. And thirdly, we agreed to minister to them. We can't adequately minister to all of our givers, so we prioritize ministering to the support club. The support club gives veteran staff a way of putting a fence around your givers so they're not always leaving. You need to have something like that. Otherwise, you'll need to depend on always finding new givers. Plus, it gives you a friendship that goes far beyond the money. It meets a greater need that you have. We started our support club one by one. At first, our memos went to 3 people. That was our first one. Then to 6, then to 8, and now up to 40. These 40 now are giving around $2,000 a month. Without the support club, those same 40 would probably be giving about $800 a month. A support club builds a fence around your givers, and it's one that they enjoy. So it's not just a prayer club, it's not just a money club, it's both. Veteran staff, it's a must for you. Now there's an additional handout in your notes to help get you started, but don't do it through the mail. It won't work. Do it one-to-one. All right, let's talk about strategy for a few minutes. In the strategy section of your notes, you'll notice there's a 5-page worksheet on personal strategy. If you've listened to the tapes on attitudes, mistakes, guidelines, and if you've done the Bible study, then you're ready to develop your personal strategy. Now, some of you may be tempted to skip the Bible study and just go ahead right into strategy. Let me encourage you not to do that. For example, one of our staff had the strategy to appeal to 9 people. He wanted to raise $1,800. If he had done the Bible study ahead of time, he might have been delivered from the overconscientiousness, and it would have resulted in a better strategy. So don't bypass or backstroke the Bible study. All right, let's highlight a few of the items on this worksheet. First, keep your plan simple. Complex plans are difficult to manage year after year. One staff member had the idea of every January calling up all of his supporters and inviting them to give for another year, perhaps increase. It'd be a good idea in one way in that they would give them an opportunity to upgrade their giving, but too much work. After the first year or two, we never would have carried it out. Keep it simple. Under item number 2, notice the blank for non-NAV friends. Most staff have too much of their support coming from Navigator people, and they're overlapping donors with several other staff. Your NAV-type givers are also likely supporting some other navigators. And as Larry Whitehouse says, quote, "That's a lot of hogs feeding out of the same trough." And that's true. Number 3 is a chart to analyze your givers over a 12-month period. This chart will show you trends in your donor income. It will also tell you what size gifts your donors give. For some of you, this will be a revelation. Now, don't be tempted to fill out a couple months and just let it go at that. Fill out all 12 months. You'll make some discoveries. It will pay off. If you want to make your record even more accurate, take those annual gifts that you know are coming in every year and divide those by 12 and plug that in. Now, let's take a look at a couple examples and see what we can learn. Example A. Here we have donor income of $2,200 over the past 12 months, an average number of donors of 82. $27 is the average gift size, no churches. There are 5 100 or more givers, 12 in the 50 to 99 category, 5 in the 30 to $49 category, 30 in the $16 to $29 category, and 30 in 15 or less category. Now, what observations can we make about this? First, notice that the gift average is $27. That's small. Most staff have a $40 to $50 average. Secondly, notice the large number of smaller gifts, 60 gifts of less than $30. Now, this is not a campus staff, so this is not so good. These smaller donors could be asked to increase. Notice also the small number of $30 to $49 donors. That category needs filling. And finally, notice that this staff has no church support. Every staff should have at least one church behind them, perhaps their current church or a home church. Missionaries, it's even easier to get churches behind you. Let's look at another example. Example B. Here we have donor income of $1,400, 41 donors average over the past 12 months, an average gift of $33, a little better, one church at 100, 2 $100 givers, 7 $50 to $99 givers, 11 in the $30 to $49 category, 5 in the $16 to $29 category, and 15 givers who give $15 or less each month. Now, this represents a student ministry, and the 15 givers who are giving $15 or less are probably students. That's very positive. I'm finding that U.S. NAV collegiates are not approaching students as much as they used to. The once-a-year conference appeal with a 10-minute teaching by a young staff who's practicing his public speaking, that's oftentimes all the teaching and the appeal that these young students get. Now, I'm not suggesting that you try to get your students to give their parents' money away, but for people in your ministry who are growing toward discipleship, they should be invited to give. A disciple is a giver. It won't bring you up to budget, but it is a sign that their heart is with you. In my former collegiate ministries, I could predict those disciples who were really with us in heart simply by looking at their local giving. Can a person be a disciple without really being a giver? Now, the budget in this example is $2,900. This staff doesn't need to emphasize upgrading current givers. He needs more givers. While it might be tempting to fill the $16 to $29 category, that's deceiving. It would take 75 new $20 givers to get him up to budget. This staff needs some $40 givers, some $50 givers, some $100 givers, and that's where the work should be put. Item number 4 asks for your total budget package. May I encourage you to be accurate here? Put down your current total budget package or the one for the coming fiscal year. Now, this presupposes you've developed a personal budget, and it presupposes you prayed through what your NAV budget package is going to be. However, many NAV staff don't even know what their budget is. To find out, they'd have to go digging in a file someplace. It's kind of fun to ask them. Let's see, it's somewhere around 3,000, or is it 3,200? Honey, do you remember, is it 3,600? It's 3,500. We'll never get there anyway. And that's kind of the way it goes. Memorize your budget. What is it? That's your goal. That's what you're going for. Before you can start fundraising, you need to know exactly what you're going for. It's $3,243.50. What is it? Go for that. Then you'll know how to set a strategy. Number 5, on setting a deadline. Don't overlook this. A deadline will help you to concentrate your efforts and to get the job done. Without a deadline, you have no urgency. Also, your donors need to know your deadline. That gives them urgency and helps them to make a decision. Now, what kind of a deadline is realistic? Well, it's hard to say. I'd suggest you talk with your supervisor and have him help you set a deadline. With all the other ministry activities you have, be careful of being unrealistic. Under point number 7, on increasing donors' gifts. few givers will automatically increase. And few will increase as a result of a general mailing asking for an increase. Givers, as well as non-givers, will respond better if you ask them in person. Number 8, erratic givers. If you have a good relationship with an erratic giver, you may be able to help him become more consistent, especially if he's in your target. We had a giver in our ministry who gave $5 in February, $10 in September, $5 in November, $7.50 in December. Now that's an interesting giving program, isn't it? So I sensed that he was trying to give $5 a month. So I showed him his 12-month record of giving to us. He was amazed. He said, "You mean I'm not giving to you every month?" I said, "No." "Really?" And he studied that chart. It was a lesson from the Lord for him. So we did a Bible study on giving, and he never missed a month since. My goal, of course, was to increase our income, but the greater goal I had was to disciple this brother in the area of giving. A disciple is a giver. And there may be people in your ministry, or good friends of yours, that you know they're probably erratic. Well, you should have a Bible study. You should be able to help them. They'll be grateful to you. Now, what should you do if a donor misses 3 or 4 months in a row? Well, we don't want to jump on people for missing occasionally. You know, they're 20 minutes late with their giving, and we're going to get after them. After all, this is not the light bill they're paying. But if they miss 3 or 4 months in a row, and you don't say anything, they may think, didn't even miss my giving. So you maybe ought to say something. Sometimes the turnaround receipt has been lost. Sometimes the giving gets channeled in the wrong direction. It's worth checking into. If they truly have quit giving, I always send them an appreciation note, a warm thank you letter, and I even give them a gift and thank them for all they've done for us over the years. But I keep them on my mailing list. Now let's take a look at the target chart grid under number 15. The purpose of this grid is to help you determine how many new donors you'll need and in what categories. And use a pencil with an eraser, not an ink pen on this one. Let's take a look at our example B that we checked a few minutes ago. First, list the number of donors in each gift size from the 12-month chart in the actual column. That's column 1 at the left. That totals up to 41 donors, right? Second, fill in the amounts represented by each gift size in the third column, budget actual. Now we have 15 givers in the 0 to 15 category. If each of those gave about $10, that would amount to $150 in column 3. We have 5 in the 16 to 29 category. If each of those gave about $20, that would be $100 in column 3. If each of the $30 to $49 givers gave about $40, that would be around $450 in column 3. We have 7 $50 givers. If each of those gave an average of $50 to $75, we figure that would be about $400. We have 2 $100 givers, which would make $200 in one church at $100 for a total of $1,400. Third, fill in the amount of your total budget package at the bottom of column 3. In this case, $2,900. That's the staff's goal. All right, now you get the pencil out, now you experiment. Okay, we've got 15 students in the 0 to 15 category, and we feel there's 5 more we could talk to. So we want to go from 15 to a total of 20. 20 of them giving with an average of 10 apiece, that'd be about 200. We've got 5 in the 16 to 29 category. We'd like to have 10 total. That would total about 200 in column 4. We've got 11 in the 30 to 49 category. We've got to increase that quite a bit. We want to go to a total of 20 there. That'd give us a total of 800 in column 4. We've got 7 $50 givers, but we really need a lot more. So we want to get 20 in that category. That'd give us a total of about 1,000. We've got 2 $100 givers. We know of 3 people that we think we'd like to ask to give 100, so that gives us a total of 5 for a total of 500 there. Church, we want to keep the same church, but we'd like to see them double its giving. So column 4 then totals up to a total of $2,900, and that's 76 total givers. That makes a $38 average, and that's a little better. Now notice, this staff needs to add 35 new givers. The key for this staff is not upgrading. There needs to be some new givers, and most of them are in the $50 category. Do you see that? Need to have quite a few new $50 givers. So as this person goes about to develop his strategy and goes to talk to people, he needs to tell people, would you consider giving $50 a month? In fact, in this case, that's where 1/3 of his support will come from. 20 people giving 50 would be 1,000, that'd be about 1/3 of his support. So you keep reworking these numbers until you make it fit and until you feel right about it. And then you try to match the numbers with names. All right, there's 20 people I'd like to see giving 50. I've got 7, that means I need 13 more. Who are the 13? If you can't come up with 13, then it'll need to be reworked. Now, what should a good action plan look like? We want to take all this and boil it down to some action steps. Take a look at the fundraising action step sheet you have in your notes, and I'd like to show you 2 examples of action plans. The first one is weak. It's way too vague. It doesn't have enough hard-nosed fundraising to it. This staff seems to be avoiding fundraising. Visit churches in the area. Now, which churches specifically? When? Spring is not adequate. The best part of this plan is the call on 5 doctors section, but the staff member is aiming much too low. If these are friends of his, he should invite them to give 50 to 100 each. He's planning too little return there. The second action step sheet is much better. Notice the by prayer alone part, and notice how specific it is. The dates are specific too, and the amounts aimed for are realistic yet challenging. Furthermore, it relates directly to the total target chart grid we looked at. When you don't know what to do next in raising support, go back to these strategy sheets. Work through them question by question, item by item. You'll get some ideas. All right? Now you're set to develop a specific strategy.